December 19th, 1944. So 342 hours, outside Bastogne, Belgium. The air smelled of burning rubber, cordite, and the particular metallic stench that comes from red-hot tank armor cooling in winter air. Private First Class. Tommy Hutchins lay on his back in frozen mud beneath a Sherman M4A3 tank, his breath creating white fog clouds in the darkness, as his fingers worked with desperate speed on the vehicle's left suspension bogie. 800 meters to the east, German 80mm guns were methodically destroying the American defensive line, each muzzle flash briefly illuminating the Belgian countryside in orange flickers that threw dancing shadows across the damaged tank formations. The Sherman above him had thrown its left track 47 minutes earlier, when the vertical volute spring suspension system, 5 pairs of springs on each side designed to absorb the shock of 32 tons rolling over uneven terrain, had catastrophically failed on the second bogie wheel from the front. The piano wire felt impossibly thin between Tommy's grease-stained fingers, a coil of 40-inch diameter music wire that he'd carried in his maintenance kit since leaving Detroit 11 months earlier. His father had been a piano tuner for the Fisher Theater, and Tommy had grown up watching those strong, precise fingers tension strings to exact specifications, maintaining the 200 pounds of pressure per string that kept concert grands in perfect pitch. Now those same principles of tension and metallurgy were about to either save or doom 37 American soldiers sheltering behind this particular Sherman's 3-inch thick frontal armor. The wire sang as he pulled it taut, wrapping it in a figure-8 pattern around the broken suspension spring, creating a reinforcing lattice that would, if his calculations were correct, redistribute 8,000 pounds of pressure across a wider surface area. He'd performed this modification 42 times in the past 96 hours, and every single one of those Sherman tanks was now climbing slopes that the original Army ordnance specifications said were impossible. "Hutchins, we got maybe 3 minutes before those 88s walk their fire this direction." Corporal Michael DeRosa's voice came from somewhere above, strained but controlled. DeRosa was the tank commander, a former high school football coach from Pennsylvania, who'd learned in the last 4 days that the Battle of the Bulge had nothing in common with Friday night games under stadium lights. Tommy didn't respond, couldn't respond, because his entire concentration was focused on maintaining exactly 180 pounds of tension on the wire while wrapping it through the spring coils. Too loose, and the spring would collapse anyway under combat loads. Too tight, and the wire would snap the moment the tank moved, sending razor-sharp metal fragments through the crew compartment like shrapnel. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Middle C requires 196 pounds of tension. A sharp requires 171. You miss by 5 pounds, the whole piano sounds wrong. You miss by 10 pounds. Strings start breaking during concerts. The German artillery was getting closer. Tommy could hear the distinctive crump, crump, crump of 80mm rounds impacting in a methodical pattern, each explosion precisely 75 meters closer than the last. Whoever was directing that fire knew exactly what they were doing, walking the rounds up the reverse slope of Hill 545 where Colonel Samuel Hogan's Task Force Hogan had established a desperate defensive position with 24 Sherman tanks, 11 half-tracks, and approximately 400 men who were now effectively cut off from the rest of the 3rd Armored Division. The cold was savage. 11 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill that made exposed metal stick to bare skin like frozen glue. Tommy's hands were wrapped in wool glove liners, the fingers cut off so he could feel the wire's tension, and he could no longer feel his fingertips at all. That was dangerous, because if you couldn't feel the wire, you couldn't gauge the tension. And if you couldn't gauge the tension, men died. He completed the 7th wrap, then the 8th, creating a diamond pattern of reinforcement that transformed the damaged spring into something stronger than the original military specification. The Army had designed these suspensions for reliability and easy replacement, not for the kind of punishment the Ardennes terrain was delivering. Sherman tanks weighed 66 oz 800 pounds, fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and crew. That weight was distributed across 2 tracks, each track supported by 3 bogies containing 2 wheels each, and each bogie was cushioned by a vertical volute spring, a compact coil spring mounted vertically in a cylindrical housing. When those springs failed, the tank became immobile, and an immobile tank in combat was just an expensive coffin. The first time Tommy had seen a suspension spring fail was December 16th, the opening day of the German offensive, when a Sherman from Baker Company had tried to climb a muddy slope near Ligneville. The tank had made it halfway up the 38-degree incline when the left front bogie spring compressed completely, the steel coils binding against each other with no remaining travel. The tank had immediately slewed sideways, presenting its thin side armor to a German Panther tank positioned 600 meters away in the tree line. The Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun had fired once, and 35 seconds later, Tommy was helping pull the charred bodies of 5 men from the burning wreckage. That night, unable to sleep, he disassembled a suspension bogie from a knocked-out Sherman and studied the spring design by flashlight. The vertical volute spring was essentially a compact coil spring, but the Army had spec'd it for normal road and off-road use, not for the kind of extreme angles the Belgian terrain demanded. Piano wire, high carbon steel, tensile strength of 270,000 to 290,000 pounds per square inch. His father's voice again. This wire can hold more weight per inch than almost any other material. They used to use it for aircraft control cables before they invented better alloys. Tommy had carried a 50-foot coil of 0.040-inch music wire in his maintenance kit, a sentimental touch from home that now seemed like divine providence. If he could wrap the wire in a reinforcing pattern around the existing spring, creating additional load paths, he might be able to increase the spring's effective capacity by 40 or 50%. It was completely against regulations, utterly unauthorized, and probably violated about 50 different Army ordnance specifications. It was also the only thing that might keep these tanks mobile in terrain that was systematically destroying them. The 9th rap. The 10th. His fingers were moving by feel now, muscle memory taking over as conscious thought receded. The German artillery was very close, maybe 200 meters away based on the sound. He could hear the high-velocity crack of the 80-meter rounds passing overhead, that distinctive supersonic snap that meant death if you were standing instead of lying down. Someone was screaming somewhere, a high keening sound that cut through the rumble of distant engines and the sporadic chatter of machine gun fire. Tommy blocked it out. The wire required his complete attention. 11 raps. 12. The pattern was holding, the diamond lattice of high tensile steel creating a cage around the damaged spring that would distribute the load across a wider area. "Hutchins, I can see their muzzle flashes. We gotta move now." That was Sergeant William Bradley, the platoon's senior NCO, a man who'd survived North Africa and Sicily and had that particular quality of voice that made you listen even when your brain was telling you to run. Tommy twisted the wire ends together with a pair of needle-nose pliers, creating a splice that he then reinforced with 2 additional wraps. The joint wouldn't be as strong as a properly welded connection, but it would hold. It had held 42 times before. He slid out from under the Sherman, his back and shoulders screaming from 47 minutes of lying on frozen ground, and immediately ran to the front of the tank, where the thrown track lay in a twisted jumble on the muddy slope. 2 other men from the maintenance crew, Private Eddie Kowalski from Chicago and Private James Lee from San Francisco, were already there with track repair tools and a dozer blade half-track that would provide the leverage to lift the track back onto the drive sprockets. The track weighed approximately 600 pounds per section, and they had to lift it, guide it onto the front drive sprocket, then use the tank's own engine to pull it tight around the bogie wheels and rear idler. In perfect conditions with a crew of 6 men and proper equipment, this took 45 minutes. They had maybe 90 seconds before German artillery fire made the position untenable. Tommy grabbed the track pin hammer, a 15-pound steel sledge designed to drive the hardened steel connector pins that linked each track section. Kowalski and Lee were already positioning the dozer blade's lifting arm under the track, and when Tommy gave the signal, the half-track's engine roared and the blade arm lifted, raising the track just high enough to clear the drive sprocket. Tommy and 2 crew members from the Sherman itself, the driver and bow gunner who'd bailed out to help, grabbed the track and manhandled it onto the sprocket teeth, forcing the heavy steel links into position while the dozer blade held the weight. The Sherman's engine was already running, the Ford GAA V8 idling at 800 RPM with that distinctive deep rumble that meant 500 horsepower waiting to be unleashed. The driver, a kid from Iowa named Peterson, who looked about 16 years old, was back in his position, both hands on the steering levers, ready to engage the transmission the moment Tommy gave the signal. Track tension was critical. Too loose, and the track would throw again within 100 yards. Too tight, and it would bind on the bogie wheels, overstress the already damaged suspension, and probably snap the track entirely. Tommy had learned from his father that perfection wasn't about absolute precision. It was about finding the right balance point where all the forces canceled each other out. Go! Tommy slammed his hand against the Sherman's hull, and Peterson engaged the transmission, the tank lurching forward exactly 1 foot. The track caught, rolled over the bogie wheels, and settled into position with the satisfying clunk of properly aligned components. Tommy grabbed a track pin and hammer, driving the connector pin through the track link eyes with 4 perfectly placed strikes that seated the pin without damaging the surrounding metal. The 80mm artillery had found their range. 3 rounds impacted in rapid succession, each one closer than the last, throwing up geysers of frozen earth and shrapnel that rattled against the Sherman's armor like steel rain. Tommy didn't run. Running would mean leaving the track unsecured, which would mean the modification was worthless. He drove 2 more pins, completing the track repair, then banged twice on the Sherman's hull. The tank lurched forward immediately, its weight now properly distributed across the repaired suspension, and Tommy threw himself flat as another 80mm round impacted exactly where he'd been standing 3 seconds earlier. The Sherman accelerated up the slope, its repaired left track gripping the frozen mud with the help of the piano wire reinforcement that was now bearing approximately 11,000 pounds of pressure per square inch and holding. Tommy watched it climb, the tank's nose rising to a 41-degree angle as it crested the hill's military crest, the point just below the actual summit where a vehicle could fire while remaining protected from direct observation. From that position, the Sherman 75mm M3 gun could engage German armor in the valley below, while the tank's hull remained largely protected by the terrain. It was a tactical geometry that only worked if your tanks could climb slopes the enemy thought impossible. 43, Tommy said to nobody in particular, his voice hoarse from breathing cordite smoke. 43 tanks. Sergeant Bradley appeared beside him, materializing out of the darkness like a ghost. The sergeant was 34 years old, ancient by infantry standards, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by someone who'd run out of patience halfway through the job. He'd been at Kasserine Pass in North Africa, where American forces had gotten destroyed by the Afrika Korps, and he had the particular coldness in his eyes that came from watching friends die while learning lessons that should have been taught in training. "Kid," Bradley said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you realize you've just changed how tank combat works in this sector, right? Every Sherman we've got is now climbing terrain the Germans think is impassable. Colonel Hogan's been watching your mods for the last 3 days. He wants you at the command post. Tommy's brain, still processing the adrenaline dump from working under artillery fire, took several seconds to understand what Bradley was saying. The command post was where officers planned operations, where tactical decisions got made that shaped the flow of entire battles. Maintenance personnel didn't go to command posts. They fixed things in motor pools and forward repair stations, got yelled at for taking too long, and occasionally got killed by artillery fire while trying to keep the equipment running. They definitely didn't get invited to talk strategy with lieutenant colonels. "Sergeant, I don't," Tommy started, but Bradley cut him off with a raised hand. "Colonel's orders, Hutchins. And between you and me?" Bradley's granite face cracked into something that might have been a smile if you squinted hard enough. "You're probably about to have the most interesting conversation of your life. The colonel's got 19 more Shermans that need your magic wire trick, and he's got a plan that's going to make the Germans wish they'd stayed in their nice warm bunkers back in the Siegfried Line." The command post was a reinforced Belgian farmhouse 300 meters behind the defensive line, its stone walls pockmarked with shrapnel scars and its roof partially collapsed from German artillery fire 2 days earlier. Inside, illuminated by the yellow glow of Coleman lanterns running on purified gasoline, Colonel Samuel Hogan was studying a terrain map with his operations officer and artillery liaison. Hogan was 33 years old, a West Point graduate who'd led Task Force Hogan through some of the worst fighting in the Ardennes, and he had the look of a man who'd been making life-or-death decisions on 4 hours of sleep for the past 96 hours. When Tommy entered, mud-covered, grease-stained, and smelling like a combination of diesel fuel and burned rubber, the colonel looked up and nodded once. "Private Hutchins, they tell me you've been modifying my tanks with piano wire." There was no accusation in his voice, just flat statement of fact delivered in the tone of someone who had neither time nor patience for anything except the truth. "Yes, sir," Tommy said, standing at a position that wasn't quite attention, but wasn't quite at ease either. The stance of someone who'd been in the Army long enough to know that formality mattered, but flexibility mattered more. Reinforcing the suspension springs on the vertical volute spring bogies. The wire creates additional load paths that allow the springs to compress further under extreme angles without binding. It's increasing our effective climbing angle by approximately 8 to 12 degrees depending on terrain conditions and tank load. The words came out in a rush, technical specifications mixed with practical observation, and Tommy realized he was talking to a colonel the same way he'd talked to another mechanic in the motor pool. But Hogan just nodded, his eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "Show me," the colonel said, pointing at the terrain map spread across the farmhouse's dining room table. The map showed Hill 545 and the surrounding valleys in precise topographic detail, with German positions marked in red and American positions marked in blue. Tommy looked at the map, seeing not just terrain features but gradient angles, bearing strengths, and the complex interplay of physics that determined whether a 33-ton vehicle could climb a slope without sliding backwards or throwing a track. "Sir, standard Army doctrine says a Sherman can handle a 31-degree slope on firm ground, maybe 24 degrees in mud. But with the piano wire reinforcement, I'm seeing sustained climbs at 38 to 42 degrees, sometimes even steeper for short bursts. That changes the entire tactical picture, because positions the Germans think are protected by terrain become death traps," Hogan finished, a hard smile crossing his face. "Because my tanks can get hull-down positions on slopes the Germans don't think we can climb, which means we can engage their armor from unexpected angles while remaining protected by the terrain geometry." The colonel traced a line on the map with one finger, following the contour lines of a valley northwest of their current position. "There's a German armor concentration here, probably 40 to 50 tanks from the 116th Panzer Division. They're using this valley as an assembly area because the slopes on both sides are too steep for our Shermans to climb. Or at least, that's what they think." Tommy felt his pulse accelerate as he understood what Hogan was proposing. The valley slopes were marked at 43 to 47 degrees, terrain that no Army manual said was climbable by tracked vehicles. But with the piano wire modifications, with the suspension springs able to compress fully without binding, those slopes became not just climbable, but tactically advantageous. A Sherman positioned on a 45-degree slope would have perfect plunging fire down into the valley, could engage the thin top armor of German tanks, and would present its own thickly armored front to any return fire. It was the same principle as medieval castles building on hilltops. Height advantage converted geometric positioning into military superiority. "I'll need about 6 hours to modify another 19 tanks, sir," Tommy said, his brain already calculating wire requirements, spring patterns, and the logistics of performing simultaneous modifications on multiple vehicles. "And I'll need help. At least 4 more men who can follow precise instructions about wire tension. This isn't something you can eyeball. The wraps have to be exactly right or the springs will fail anyway." "You've got 3 hours," Hogan said flatly, "and you've got every mechanic in this task force. As of right now, Private Hutchins, your only job is to make my entire remaining tank force capable of climbing slopes the Germans think are impossible. After that," the colonel's smile turned predatory, "after that, we're going to teach the 116th Panzer Division a lesson about underestimating American ingenuity." And just like that, Tommy Hutchins from Detroit, Michigan, 19 years old, son of a piano tuner, found himself at the center of a tactical innovation that would ripple through the entire Battle of the Bulge. Outside, the temperature continued to drop toward zero. German artillery continued its methodical destruction of American defensive positions, and 50,000 German soldiers were pressing forward in what would become history's largest battle fought by the U.S. Army. But in that Belgian farmhouse, gathered around a terrain map lit by Coleman lanterns, a handful of men were planning to turn piano wire and basic physics into a weapon that would change the mathematics of armored combat. Tommy followed Sergeant Bradley back out into the frozen darkness, his mind already racing through the modifications he'd need to make. 19 tanks, 3 hours. That meant approximately 9.5 minutes per tank if he worked continuously without breaks, which was impossible. But if he could teach 4 other mechanics the wire wrapping pattern, they could work simultaneously, bringing the time down to something approaching feasible. The key would be the tension. Too many people got that wrong, thinking that tighter was always better. His father had spent years teaching him that the right tension was the one that balanced all the forces, that made the system work as an integrated whole rather than a collection of overstressed parts fighting each other. "Sergeant," Tommy said as they walked between the dispersed Sherman positions, "I need volunteers who can follow precise instructions, not the guys who think they know better, not the guys who want to improvise. I need people who can wrap wire exactly the way I show them, and not deviate by even half a turn." Bradley snorted, a sound that might have been amusement or might have been contempt for human nature in general. "Kid, right now every mechanic in this task force would volunteer to kiss a German 88 if you told them it would keep their tanks running. You just became the most popular man in the motor pool. Let's go round up your crew." They found the first volunteer underneath Sherman number 312, a tank that had thrown both its left side tracks when it tried to back up a muddy slope 2 hours earlier. Private Eddie Kowalski was from Chicago, 22 years old, son of a tool and die maker who'd worked for Caterpillar before the war. He understood precision, understood that tolerances mattered, understood that in machinery there was no such thing as close enough. When Tommy explained the wire pattern, figure 8 wraps maintaining 180 pounds of tension across a diamond lattice, Kowalski nodded once and said, "Like tensioning a cylinder head, got it." That was exactly the right answer. The second volunteer was Technical Sergeant Marcus Delacroix from Louisiana, 29 years old, a man who'd rebuilt swamp boat engines with baling wire and prayers before the Army taught him that proper tools existed. He had that particular competence that came from years of making broken things work with whatever materials were available, and when Tommy showed him the wire pattern on a practice spring, Delacroix wrapped it perfectly on the first try. "Fish net pattern," the sergeant said. "Distributes the load just like a casting net. Smart." The third and fourth volunteers were both from the same Sherman crew, driver Private James Lee from San Francisco and bow gunner Private Robert Chen from Portland. Both were second-generation Americans whose parents had emigrated from China in the 1920s, and both had that particular focused intensity that came from proving yourself in a system that didn't always want you there. When Tommy explained the physics of load distribution, Chen asked 3 precise questions about failure modes, and Lee asked about temperature effects on wire tensile strength. Those were exactly the right questions. By 0444 5 hours, 5 teams of mechanics were working simultaneously on Sherman tanks spread across the reverse slope of Hill 545, each team following the pattern Tommy had developed through 42 previous modifications. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the piano wire became brittle if you bent it too sharply, warm enough that your hands wouldn't immediately freeze to bare metal. Tommy moved from tank to tank, checking tension, verifying wrap patterns, occasionally demonstrating a difficult section where the wire had to thread through tight spaces around the bogie housing. He developed a feel for the right tension, could tell by the way the wire sang when you plucked it, whether it was carrying 180 pounds or 200 pounds. His father had taught him that, the ability to tune by ear to hear the difference between perfect pitch and close enough. By 0630 hours, they'd completed 9 tanks. By 0745 hours, 15. The work took on a rhythm, a coordinated dance of men and metal and wire that flowed from one vehicle to the next. Each successful modification meant another Sherman capable of climbing impossible slopes, another tactical option for Colonel Hogan's increasingly desperate defense. The German artillery had slackened somewhat as dawn approached, the enemy gunners probably changing shifts or waiting for better light to adjust their fire. That gave the maintenance crews a precious window of relative safety to complete their work. At 082 hours, as Tommy was finishing the wire reinforcement on the 19th Sherman, a runner from the command post appeared with new orders. The attack was launching in 43 minutes. Colonel Hogan wanted every modified Sherman in position on the northern ridge line, hidden in the tree line, engines cold, to avoid thermal signature detection by German observers. When the German armor concentration in the valley below started their morning movement, intelligence said that happened around 0900 hours based on 3 days of observation. Task Force Hogan's Shermans would unleash a coordinated volley from positions the Germans thought were impossible to reach. Tommy completed the final wire wrap at 0829 hours, made one last check of the tension, perfect, and then watched as the Sherman he'd just modified started its engine and began climbing the 44-degree slope toward the ridgeline firing position. The tank's suspension compressed fully, the piano wire reinforcements taking the load, distributing the stress, allowing the bogies to travel through their full range of motion without binding. The Sherman reached the military crest, positioned itself behind a fallen tree that concealed its silhouette, and shut down its engine. 18 other Shermans were doing the same thing along 600 meters of ridgeline, a coordinated ambush that exploited terrain in ways that weren't supposed to be possible. Sergeant Bradley appeared beside Tommy again, this time carrying 2 tin cups of what the Army optimistically called coffee, but which tasted more like boiled acorns mixed with diesel fuel. "Drink this," Bradley said. "You've been working for 4 hours straight in sub-freezing temperatures. Your body's probably about 30 minutes from shutting down whether you feel it or not." Tommy took the cup, the warmth more valuable than the taste, and realized that Bradley was right. He was shaking, not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion, and the adrenaline crash that came from sustaining maximum effort for extended periods. "What happens now?" Tommy asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Now?" Bradley's granite face cracked into that almost smile again. "Now we find out if piano wire is stronger than German armor. And kid?" The sergeant's voice dropped into a register that Tommy had learned meant serious information was about to be delivered. "If this works, and I mean really works, the way the colonel thinks it will, you just invented something that's going to get written up in after-action reports and tactical manuals. You just changed how the U.S. Army fights in extreme terrain. Not bad for a piano tuner's kid from Detroit." At 0855 hours, Tommy was positioned in a foxhole on the ridge line, theoretically there to make emergency repairs, but actually there because Colonel Hogan had decided that the man who'd enabled this attack should witness its execution. Through the pre-dawn darkness, Tommy could hear the distant rumble of German armor in the valley below, the distinctive deep throb of Maybach engines that powered Panther and Tiger tanks. The Germans were moving early, probably trying to reach attack positions before American artillery observers could call in fire missions. They had no idea that 19 American tanks were positioned on slopes above them, had no reason to suspect that the terrain they thought was impassable had been conquered by 50 feet of music wire, and the desperate ingenuity of young men who refused to accept that something was impossible just because the manual said so. At precisely 0900 hours, Colonel Hogan's voice came over the radio net. "All Hogan units, this is Hogan 6. Fire on designated targets. Execute, execute, execute." 19 Sherman 75mm guns fired simultaneously, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the ridgeline in orange-white strobes that seemed to tear holes in the darkness. Tommy watched through binoculars as the first volley of armor-piercing rounds, M61 APC ammunition traveling at 2,030 feet per second, arced down into the valley and impacted German armor with devastating precision. The physics of the engagement favored the Americans completely. Firing from elevated positions, the Sherman's rounds struck the thin top armor of German tanks, armor that was typically 16 to 25 millimeters thick, compared to the 80 to 100 millimeters of frontal armor. A 75mm armor-piercing round that might bounce off a Panther's frontal plate punched through the tank's roof armor like a hammer through wet cardboard, detonating the ammunition or igniting the fuel and turning the vehicle into a funeral pyre for its crew. The German response was immediate, but ineffective. Panther and Panzer IV tanks tried to traverse their turrets upward to engage the American positions, but their guns couldn't elevate high enough to reach targets positioned 40-plus degrees above them. It was the same problem that had plagued coastal defense guns trying to engage aircraft. Weapons designed for relatively flat trajectory fire simply couldn't achieve the elevation angles necessary for extreme uphill engagement. A few German tanks tried to climb the valley slopes to reach fighting positions, but the 43-degree inclines defeated them immediately. Without piano wire reinforcements, without modifications to their suspension systems, the German tanks simply couldn't generate enough traction or maintain enough stability to climb slopes that steep. They slewed sideways, through tracks, or rolled backwards into the valley floor. The second volley from the Shermans fired 14 seconds after the first, a coordinated cascade of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds that caught German armor attempting to disperse. Tommy watched through binoculars as a Panther tank tried to reverse out of the killing zone, only to have its engine compartment penetrated by a 75mm round that must have hit the thin rear armor at a perfect angle. The tank stopped dead, black smoke pouring from its engine deck, and seconds later the crew bailed out through the hatches. The third volley caught a cluster of Panzer IV tanks that had been forming up for their own attack, and within 90 seconds of the engagement's start, the valley floor was littered with burning German armor. "Holy Mother of God," Sergeant Bradley whispered beside Tommy, his binoculars tracking the carnage below. "They can't even shoot back. It's not a battle. It's an execution." And it was. For the next 17 minutes, Task Force Hogan's 19 Sherman tanks systematically destroyed every piece of German armor in the valley using tactics that weren't supposed to be possible, firing from positions that weren't supposed to be reachable, exploiting terrain that wasn't supposed to be exploitable. The piano wire modifications had transformed steep slopes from impassable obstacles into tactical advantages, had turned terrain geometry into a weapon more effective than any gun. By 0922 hours, when Colonel Hogan ordered ceasefire, the valley contained 31 burning German tanks, 8 destroyed self-propelled guns, and an unknown number of damaged vehicles limping away toward German lines, trailing smoke and broken tracks. Tommy's hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't from cold or exhaustion. It was from the sudden realization that his improvised modification, his desperate attempt to keep broken tanks running, had just enabled what might be the most one-sided tank engagement of the entire Ardennes campaign. 31 kills, 0 losses. All because 50 feet of piano wire could reinforce a suspension spring in ways the Army's engineers had never imagined. All because a 19-year-old piano tuner's kid from Detroit had refused to accept that broken equipment meant you stopped fighting. Sergeant Bradley lowered his binoculars and turned to face Tommy directly. And for the first time since Tommy had met him, the granite-faced sergeant looked genuinely impressed. "Kid," Bradley said slowly, as if testing out the words before committing to them, "I've been in this man's army for 11 years, fought in North Africa, Sicily, France, now Belgium. I've seen brave men, smart men, lucky men. But what you just did?" Bradley shook his head, something that might have been respect flickering across his face. "That's something different. That's the kind of thing that changes how wars get fought. And the battle's not even close to over yet." Which was true because Colonel Hogan's voice was already coming over the radio net with new orders. And those orders involved the 23 other Sherman tanks that hadn't participated in the Valley ambush. And those orders involved piano wire modifications and impossible slopes, and taking the fight to German positions that thought they were safe behind terrain barriers. And Tommy Hutchins, 19 years old, hands still shaking, tools still in his belt, found himself at the exact center of a tactical revolution that he'd accidentally invented with 37 cents worth of music wire. And the knowledge his father had taught him about tension and load distribution and finding the balance point where physics worked for you instead of against you. But that story, that continuation of impossible modifications and desperate innovations and ordinary men doing extraordinary things, would have to wait for the dawn that was now breaking across the Belgian landscape, revealing the smoke columns of German armor losses and the stark reality of what happens when simple physics gets weaponized by people who refuse to quit. The smoke from the Valley engagement was still rising in thick black columns when Colonel Hogan summoned Tommy back to the command post at 0947 hours. The farmhouse had taken 2 more direct hits from German artillery during the night, collapsing most of the second floor, but the stone walls on the ground level still provided enough protection for tactical planning. Inside, the temperature was maybe 15 degrees warmer than outside, which meant it was cold enough to see your breath but not cold enough to freeze the ink in the grease pencils they were using to mark positions on the acetate-covered maps. Hogan looked like he'd aged 5 years in the 3 hours since Tommy had last seen him. The colonel's eyes were bloodshot. His hands shook slightly when he wasn't actively controlling them, and there was a quality of desperate calculation in his expression that Tommy was learning to recognize in men who'd been making life-or-death decisions for too long without sleep. "Hutchins," the colonel said without preamble, pointing at a topographic map that showed terrain west of their current position, "I need you to look at this ridgeline and tell me if it's climbable with your modifications." The map showed a series of steep slopes ranging from 39 to 52 degrees, terrain that connected Hill 545 to a higher elevation designated as Hill 400 cents in 27 on the map. German forces had established artillery positions on Hill 427, and those guns had been systematically destroying American positions for the past 72 hours. Tommy studied the map, mentally converting contour line spacing into gradient angles, factoring in soil composition based on the terrain description notes, calculating whether the piano wire reinforcements could handle sustained climbs at those angles. The 39 to 45 degree sections are definitely doable, sir. We've already proven that. The 48 to 52 degree sections, he trailed off, doing mental calculations about the physics of traction and the limits of track design. Sir, at 52 degrees, you're approaching the angle where the tank's center of gravity becomes unstable. Even if the suspension holds, even if the tracks grip, the vehicle could flip backwards if the driver applies too much throttle. Hogan nodded slowly, as if Tommy had just confirmed something he'd already suspected. What if we winch them up the steepest sections? Use the dozer blade half-tracks to provide anchor points and pull the Shermans up with steel cables? That was actually brilliant, Tommy realized. The limiting factor on extreme slopes wasn't necessarily the suspension or even the engine power. It was traction and stability. But if you anchored a heavy vehicle at the top of the slope and used it as a fixed point to winch lighter vehicles upward, you bypassed the traction problem entirely. The winched vehicle's tracks would still need to grip enough to keep it from sliding sideways, but the primary upward force would come from the cable tension rather than the engine's drivetrain. That could work, sir, Tommy said, his mind already racing through the mechanical requirements. We'd need at least 3 dozer blade half-tracks positioned at intervals along the climb, because a single cable pull over 200 meters would generate so much friction heat that the cable might fail. And we'd need to reinforce the Sherman's toe points, because the standard hooks aren't rated for that kind of sustained tension. But yes, sir, that could work. How long to modify 23 tanks? Hogan asked. And Tommy could see in the colonel's eyes that this wasn't an academic question. This was the foundation of whatever desperate plan was taking shape in the officer's exhausted brain. Tommy looked at the map again, at the slope gradients and the distances involved, and did the math. 23 tanks. Each one needed piano wire suspension reinforcement, which took approximately 35 minutes per tank with a trained crew. Each one also needed reinforced toe points, which meant welding additional steel plates to distribute the load, which took maybe 15 minutes per vehicle if you had an arc welder and knew what you were doing. 6 hours for the suspension modifications if I've got my 5-man crew working simultaneously. Another 3 hours for the toe point reinforcements. 9 hours total, sir, assuming nothing breaks and we don't lose time to artillery fire. Hogan checked his watch, a battered Hamilton that had survived Africa and Sicily and looked like it was held together with willpower and cleaning oil. It's 0953 hours now. I need those tanks operational by 2200 hours tonight. That gives you 12 hours and 7 minutes. Can you do it? Tommy thought about the temperature, which was supposed to drop to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by afternoon, according to the weather forecast. He thought about working with piano wire in sub-freezing conditions, about arc welding in darkness, with German artillery randomly dropping rounds across the position, about the inevitable delays and complications that happened when you were trying to modify military equipment under combat conditions. Yes, sir, he said, because that was the only acceptable answer when a colonel asked if you could do something that might save the lives of several hundred men. Outstanding. Hogan turned to his operations officer, a captain named Marcus Webb, who looked like he'd been awake for approximately the same amount of time as the colonel. Captain, coordinate with the motor pool. Hutchins gets priority access to every arc welder, every steel plate, every tool and material he needs. The rest of the task force goes to ground during daylight hours. No movement, no engine noise, minimal radio traffic. We let the Germans think we're hurt worse than we are. Then after dark, we climb the mountain and kill their artillery. The way Hogan said it, flat and matter-of-fact, made it sound like a routine operation, rather than what was essentially a mechanized infantry assault up terrain that no doctrine said was passable. But Tommy was learning that this was how wars actually got fought, not through careful adherence to doctrine and proper procedure, but through desperate improvisation and the willingness to attempt things that seemed impossible. By 10:45 hours, Tommy had assembled his crew in a partially collapsed barn 400 meters behind the front line. The barn's roof was gone, destroyed by artillery fire 2 days earlier, but 3 of its stone walls still stood and provided enough wind protection to make outdoor metal work marginally feasible. 2 arc welders had been scavenged from knocked-out vehicles, their generators running on gasoline that was supposed to be reserved for combat operations, but which Colonel Hogan had personally authorized for this modification work. Private Eddie Kowalski from Chicago was already cutting steel plate into reinforcement sections using an oxyacetylene torch, the bright blue flame creating a small circle of warmth in the freezing air. Technical Sergeant Marcus Delacroix from Louisiana was inventorying piano wire supplies. They'd used approximately 180 feet on the first 43 tank modifications, which left maybe 320 feet in Tommy's original coil, plus whatever additional wire they could scavenge from knocked-out vehicles. "We're going to run out of wire," Delacroix said flatly, his Louisiana accent more pronounced when he was delivering bad news. 23 more tanks, at roughly 4 feet per tank, that's 92 feet minimum. We've got enough for that plus maybe 15 more vehicles after these. After that, we're done unless we find another source. Tommy had already been thinking about this problem. Piano wire wasn't exactly standard Army issue, and you couldn't substitute regular steel wire because the tensile strength was completely different. Piano wire was high-carbon spring steel, heat-treated to achieve a tensile strength of 270,000 to 290,000 psi. Regular steel wire was maybe 60,000 to 80,000 psi, which meant it would snap under the same loads that piano wire could handle. "There's piano wire in intact pianos," Tommy said slowly, thinking out loud. "Belgian farmhouses, churches, schools. Every piano has approximately 220 strings, averaging about 3 feet each. That's 660 feet of wire per piano, if we can harvest it without damaging the temper." Kowalski looked up from his cutting work, his face illuminated by the torch's blue flame. "You want us to steal wire from Belgian pianos?" There was no judgment in his voice, just the practical question of someone trying to understand the mission parameters. "Not steal," Tommy corrected. "Requisition for military necessity, there's a difference. And yeah, that's exactly what I want. After we finish modifying these 23 tanks, I want teams out searching every intact building within 5 kilometers for pianos. We harvest the wire carefully. Don't just rip the strings out, because that can damage the steel's temper. Use wire cutters, clip close to the tuning pins, coil it properly for storage. Every piano we find is potentially 15 more tank modifications." "Kids thinking like a logistics officer," Sergeant Bradley said, appearing from somewhere with the supernatural timing that senior NCOs seem to develop. "Which is good, because logistics wins wars. Courage and firepower just make good stories." Bradley was carrying a wooden crate that he set down with surprising gentleness, and when Tommy looked inside, he saw approximately 40 pounds of steel plate, pre-cut into rectangular sections that were perfect for reinforcing toe points. "Compliments of the Ordnance Company," Bradley explained. "Captain Webb told them what we needed, and they cut these from the armor plate off a knocked-out German half-track. Krupp steel, actually stronger than our own stuff. The Germans welded it better than we did too, so it's going to be a pain to work with. But it'll hold when you're winching a 33-ton tank up a 50-degree slope." The first Sherman arrived at 11:12 hours, rumbling into the ruined barn with its engine running and its crew looking simultaneously exhausted and wired. The combination of too much coffee and too little sleep that Tommy was starting to recognize as the default state for everyone in Task Force Hogan. The tank commander was a staff sergeant named William Kowalski, no relation to Eddie, though they'd compared family trees, and discovered they both had relatives from the same village outside Krakow. And he had the look of a man who'd been through enough combat to know when to ask questions and when to just let the mechanics work. "Hutchins?" Kowalski called from his commander's position in the turret. "You're the piano wire guy? They say you can make my Sherman climb straight up the side of a mountain." "Not quite straight up," Tommy replied, already sliding underneath the Sherman to examine its suspension bogies. "But I can probably get you up a 50-degree slope if the driver knows what he's doing, and we've got a winch cable for the really steep sections." He pulled out his flashlight, a standard Army TL-122, powered by 2 D-cell batteries that were getting weaker every day because replacement batteries were being saved for radio equipment, and examined the left front bogie assembly. The vertical volute spring showed the typical wear pattern of a tank that had been driven hard through mud and over rough terrain, compression marks where the spring coils had been binding against each other, stress discoloration on the steel, and a slight bending of the spring's vertical axis that indicated the entire assembly was about 30 hours away from catastrophic failure, even without the extreme angles they were about to subject it to. Tommy measured the spring's free height with calipers, 187 millimeters, compared to the factory specification of 195 millimeters, which meant the spring had already lost about 4% of its design travel. That wasn't good, but it wasn't catastrophic either. The piano wire reinforcement would compensate for the reduced spring travel by distributing loads more evenly across the remaining coil surface. He marked the spring's position with a grease pencil, then moved to the second bogie and repeated the measurement. This one was in better shape, 191 millimeters free height, only about 2% compression loss. The third bogie showed 189 millimeters. All three were within the range where wire reinforcement would be effective. "Kowalski," Tommy called up to the tank commander, "I need your driver to shut down the engine and for everyone to clear the vehicle. We're going to be working underneath for the next 40 minutes, and I don't want anybody getting carbon monoxide poisoning from exhaust fumes in this enclosed space." The tank's Ford GAA V8 engine rumbled to silence, and the crew bailed out through their hatches with the practiced speed of men who'd done this drill 100 times. They scattered to various corners of the barn, some pulling out cigarettes, others just sitting down heavily against the walls, with the 1,000-yard stare that came from sustained combat stress. Tommy didn't have time to worry about that. He had 6 suspension bogies to modify on this tank, 12 more bogies on the right side, and then 22 more tanks after this one, all before 2,200 hours. Private James Lee from San Francisco appeared beside him with the piano wire coil and a pair of leather gloves. "I measured out 4 feet 3 inches per bogie based on your original pattern," Lee said, his voice precise and clipped in the way of someone who'd learned English as a second language and spoke it more correctly than most native speakers. "That gives us a 6-inch margin for error on each spring, which should be adequate unless we encounter compression damage that requires additional wraps." Tommy nodded, impressed as always by Lee's attention to detail. The driver had picked up the wire wrapping technique faster than anyone else on the crew, and his modifications held just as well as Tommy's own work. "Good. You take the left side, I'll take the right side. We work simultaneously to keep the tank's weight balanced. If one side gets significantly more reinforcement before the other, the suspension geometry gets thrown off and the vehicle will pull to one side." They worked in synchronized rhythm, sliding under the tank from opposite sides, wrapping wire in the figure 8 pattern that had become as familiar as breathing. The wire sang its characteristic high-pitched tone when properly tensioned, and Tommy had learned to distinguish between the sound of 175 pounds of tension, slightly flat, like a piano wire tuned a quarter step low, and 185 pounds, slightly sharp, strained, likely to snap under sustained load. The sweet spot was 180 pounds plus or minus 3 pounds, which produced a pure tone that resonated at approximately 440 hertz. Concert A, the note his father had used as the reference pitch for every piano tuning job. The barn's ruined walls provided almost no protection from the wind, and the temperature was dropping as noon approached. The cold front that the weather forecasters had predicted settling over the Ardennes like a frozen blanket. Tommy's fingers were going numb despite the leather glove liners, and he had to stop periodically to warm them against his body heat before continuing the wire work. Cold fingers meant imprecise tension, and imprecise tension meant spring failure, and spring failure meant dead men in burning tanks. So he worked carefully, methodically, checking each wrap twice before moving to the next coil. By 11:47 hours, the first Sherman was complete, all 12 bogies reinforced. Suspension travel increased by an estimated 40%, climbing capability improved from 31 degrees to approximately 48 degrees, depending on terrain conditions. Tommy slid out from under the tank, his back screaming from 35 minutes of lying on frozen ground, and signaled for the crew to remount. Staff Sergeant Kowalski dropped back into his commander's position. The driver started the engine, and the Sherman rumbled out of the barn toward the vehicle staging area where it would wait for the night's operation. 17 minutes after the first tank departed, the second Sherman arrived. This one was from Charlie Company, commanded by a lieutenant named Robert Chen, same last name as Tommy's bow gunner, but no relation, though they'd joked about starting a clan association after the war. Chen's tank had thrown its right rear track 2 days earlier during a fighting retreat from German positions, and although the track had been repaired, the suspension springs on that side were showing stress fractures that would normally require complete replacement. "Can you fix it?" Chen asked, and Tommy could hear the desperation under the professional tone. A tank with failing suspension wasn't just unreliable, it was a death trap, because the moment you needed maximum mobility was exactly when the springs would fail completely. "I can reinforce it," Tommy said carefully. "The wire wrapping will distribute the load across a wider surface area, which reduces the stress concentration at the fracture points. It won't be as strong as a new spring, but it should hold for at least 200 kilometers of operation, probably more. Just tell your driver to avoid sharp impacts if possible. Don't slam into obstacles, don't drop off ledges, don't do anything that creates sudden compression loads." Chen nodded once, the gesture of a man accepting information that might keep him alive. 200 kilometers. That's enough to get us up the ridge and back down, with margin for maneuvering. Do it. Tommy and his crew worked through the afternoon, tank after tank, the rhythm becoming almost meditative despite the cold and the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional German reconnaissance plane droning overhead. Each Sherman received the same careful attention: wire reinforcement on all 12 suspension bogies, measurements to ensure even tension, visual inspection for stress fractures or damage that might cause premature failure. And while the suspension work proceeded, Kowalski and Delacroix were installing reinforced toe points using the arc welders, their blue-white flames throwing dancing shadows across the barn's stone walls. The toe point reinforcement was surprisingly complex. Standard Sherman tanks had simple tow hooks welded to the front and rear hull, adequate for pulling the vehicle out of mud or over obstacles, but not designed for the sustained tension of winching a 33-ton vehicle up a 50-degree slope. That kind of load could rip the tow hooks right off the hull, taking chunks of armor plate with them. So Kowalski was welding additional steel plates around each tow hook, creating a reinforcement cage that distributed the load across a larger area of the hull. The German armor plate they were using, salvaged from a knocked-out SDKFZ 251 half-track, was actually superior to American steel for this application, with higher carbon content that made it stronger, but more difficult to weld. Kowalski was having to preheat the plates with a torch before welding to prevent the metal from cracking under thermal stress, and the process was taking longer than anticipated. At 15:34 hours, they'd completed 9 tanks. At 17:23 hours, as twilight began settling over the frozen Belgian landscape, they'd finished 17. The temperature had dropped to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and Tommy's hands were so cold that he could barely feel the piano wire anymore. That was dangerous. If you couldn't feel the tension, you were working blind. He called a 15-minute break, gathered his crew in the least destroyed corner of the barn, and they shared lukewarm coffee from a jerry can that had been sitting on a Coleman stove for the past 3 hours. The coffee tasted like battery acid mixed with diesel fuel, but it was hot and caffeinated, and that was all that mattered. 6 more tanks, Sergeant Bradley said, appearing as always without warning. You're ahead of schedule, which is good because Captain Webb just got a new weather forecast. Temperature's going to drop to 0 by midnight, maybe -5 by 0200 hours. The cold's actually going to help. Frozen ground provides better traction than mud, but it also means your piano wire is going to be brittle as glass. You need to factor that into your tension calculations. Tommy nodded, his brain automatically adjusting the numbers. Wire tensile strength decreased at low temperatures as the steel's crystal structure became less flexible. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit, piano wire would have maybe 5% less strength than at room temperature, which meant he needed to reduce the target tension from 180 pounds to approximately 171 pounds to avoid brittle fracture. That would reduce the suspension reinforcement's effectiveness slightly, but it was better than having wires snap under load. The final 6 tanks arrived in rapid succession as darkness fell. The crews were increasingly exhausted, increasingly desperate, increasingly aware that whatever operation Colonel Hogan was planning for tonight was probably going to be a one-way trip for at least some of them. Tommy could see it in their eyes. That particular combination of resignation and determination that came when men accepted they might die, but decided to go forward anyway. He worked as fast as he dared, wrapping wire with cold, stiffened fingers, adjusting tension by sound because he could no longer feel the wire properly. At 20:47 hours, 13 minutes ahead of schedule, the 23rd and final Sherman rumbled out of the barn with its suspension reinforced and its toe points welded. Tommy's hands were bleeding from a dozen small cuts where the wire had sliced through his glove liners, and his back felt like someone had been hitting it with a sledgehammer for the past 12 hours. But the job was done. Outstanding work, Hutchins. Colonel Hogan's voice came from the barn's entrance, and Tommy turned to see the colonel standing there with Captain Webb and Sergeant Major William Harrison, the task force's senior enlisted man. Hogan looked like walking death. His face was gray with exhaustion. His hands shook constantly now, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in at least 72 hours. But his voice was steady, his gaze was clear, and when he looked at Tommy, there was something like respect in his expression. You just gave me the capability to conduct an operation that shouldn't be possible. The Germans have artillery positions on Hill 400 Teatro, say Hill 427, that have been tearing us apart for 3 days. Those positions are protected by terrain they think we can't cross. Tonight, we're going to prove them wrong. The colonel spread a map on a mostly intact section of the barn's floor, weighing down the corners with chunks of rubble. The map showed Hill 545, their current position, connected to Hill 427 by a saddle ridge with slopes ranging from 39 to 52 degrees. German artillery positions were marked on Hill 427's summit. 2 batteries of 105mm howitzers, probably 12 guns total, with supporting infantry and anti-aircraft positions. The route Hogan was proposing would take 23 Sherman tanks up slopes that no standard doctrine said were passable, approaching the German positions from a direction they couldn't possibly expect. The winching operation starts at 2300 hours, Hogan explained, tracing the route with one finger. We move in complete radio silence using hand signals and shielded flashlights. The dozer blade half-tracks establish anchor points here, here, and here. He marked 3 positions along the route, and we winch the Shermans up the steepest sections. Your wire reinforcements keep the suspension from failing during the climb. Once we're on top, we hit the German artillery positions at 0430 hours, right before dawn. Full surprise, maximum violence, Overwhelming firepower. We destroy the guns, kill anyone who resists, and then we get back down the mountain before German reinforcements can respond. Tommy looked at the map, at the slope gradients and the distances involved, and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This operation was going to work, the physics were sound, the modifications were solid, the plan was tactically brilliant. But it was also going to be incredibly dangerous, and some of the men in those tanks weren't coming back. "Sir," Tommy said slowly, "I should go with the column. If a suspension fails during the climb, if a wire breaks or a spring collapses, I'm the only one who can fix it in the field." Hogan looked at him for a long moment, and Tommy could see the calculation happening behind those exhausted eyes. The colonel was weighing the value of having a specialized mechanic with the column against the risk of losing the man who'd enabled the entire operation. "Negative," Hogan said finally. "You're too valuable to risk on a combat operation. If something breaks, the crew abandons that vehicle and continues on foot. We can't afford to lose you, Hutchins. You're not just a mechanic anymore. You're the guy who figured out how to make American tanks do impossible things. That knowledge needs to survive this battle." There was something intensely frustrating about being told you were too important to fight, but Tommy understood the logic. If he got killed during the night's operation, the piano wire modification technique died with him. Better to preserve the knowledge and let someone else take the risk. "Yes, sir," Tommy said, though part of him wanted to argue, wanted to insist on being there to fix anything that went wrong. "But sir, I'd like to write down the modification procedure in detail. Measurements, tension specifications, wrap patterns, everything. Just in case. So if something happens to me, someone else can continue the work." "Good thinking." Hogan turned to Captain Webb. "Get Hutchins paper and pencil. He documents the entire procedure tonight, and we make 3 copies. One stays with the task force, one goes to division headquarters, one goes to Army Ordnance. This modification needs to get into the official manual." And just like that, Tommy found himself sitting in the corner of a freezing barn with a lined notebook and a grease pencil, trying to convert 12 hours of instinctive metalwork into written instructions that someone else could follow. He drew diagrams showing the wire wrap pattern, wrote out the tension specifications, 180 lbs at 40 degrees, reduced to 171 lbs at 0 degrees, increased to 188 lbs at 70 degrees, documented the signs of suspension failure that indicated which bogies needed reinforcement most urgently. His father's voice echoed in his memory. When you tune a piano, you're not just tightening strings, you're creating relationships between tones, building a harmonic structure where every note supports every other note. That's what makes the instrument sing. Tommy wrote that down too because he realized it was the fundamental principle behind why the wire reinforcement worked. You weren't just making the spring stronger, you were creating a load distribution network where stress got shared across multiple paths, where no single point carried the full weight. That was the secret. Not brute strength, but elegant distribution of forces. At 22:47 hours, the first Sherman tanks began their approach to the base of the saddle ridge. Tommy watched from an observation position on Hill 545's crest, binoculars pressed to his eyes, as the dark shapes of 23 tanks moved in near-complete silence through the frozen night. The Sherman's 4 GAA engines were surprisingly quiet at idle, and with mufflers and careful throttle control, the tanks sounded like distant thunder rather than the roar of mechanized warfare. The dozer blade half-tracks were already in position, their winch cables extended and ready to attach to the Sherman's reinforced tow points. The first tank to attempt the climb was commanded by Staff Sergeant Kowalski, the same one whose Sherman had been the first to receive the modification that afternoon. Tommy watched as the tank approached the 52-degree slope section, the steepest part of the entire route. A half-track at the top of the slope had already anchored itself, blade dug deep into frozen ground, and a crew of engineers was attaching a steel cable to Kowalski's tank. The cable was 1-inch diameter steel wire rope, rated for 44,000 pounds of tension, and it gleamed dully in the moonlight as it pulled taut. The half-track's winch engaged with a grinding of gears, and Kowalski's Sherman began to climb. The tank's tracks bit into the frozen ground, seeking purchase on rocks and frozen soil, while the cable took most of the weight. Tommy could see the suspension compressing as the Sherman's weight shifted backward during the climb, could imagine the piano wire reinforcements taking the load, distributing the stress across the spring coils. The tank climbed steadily, foot by foot, the winch cable singing with tension but holding firm. After 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours, Kowalski's Sherman crested the steep section and moved onto more moderate terrain. The second tank immediately began its climb, then the third. Tommy watched through binoculars as 23 Sherman tanks executed an ascent that every tactical manual said was impossible, climbing slopes that should have thrown tracks or collapsed suspensions or rolled backwards into catastrophic crashes. But the piano wire held. The reinforced tow points held. The frozen ground provided just enough traction, and one by one, the tanks reached the saddle ridge and continued their approach toward Hill 427's summit. At EO 427 hours, Tommy heard the first sounds of combat from Hill 427, the distinctive crack of 75mm tank guns, the heavier boom of German 150mm howitzers firing at point-blank range, the stuttering rattle of machine gun fire. Through his binoculars, he could see muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, could see the orange glow of burning vehicles and exploding ammunition. The battle lasted 19 minutes, and when it was over, 2 German artillery batteries had been destroyed, 12 105mm howitzers rendered useless, and approximately 140 German soldiers killed or captured. American losses were 2 Sherman tanks destroyed and 7 men killed. The modified Shermans began their descent at 05:12 hours, moving more quickly now, without the need for winching. The piano wire reinforcements that had enabled the climb now controlled the descent, allowing the suspension to compress fully and absorb the shock of downward movement without binding. By R0643 hours, as dawn broke over the Ardennes, 21 Sherman tanks had returned to Task Force Hogan's positions. 2 had been left burning on Hill 427, their crews mostly evacuated before the vehicles brewed up. But the mission had accomplished its objective. German artillery that had been devastating American positions for 3 days was now silent, and the immediate threat to Task Force Hogan's survival had been eliminated. Colonel Hogan found Tommy at 07:21 hours, sitting on a pile of rubble outside the barn and drinking coffee that had been brewed from grounds that had already been used twice. The colonel looked like he'd aged another 10 years in the past 6 hours, but there was satisfaction in his eyes that hadn't been there before. 58 German tanks destroyed over the past 4 days, Hogan said without preamble. 12 artillery pieces destroyed last night, approximately 407 German casualties inflicted. Our losses, 11 tanks, 22 men killed, 47 wounded. That's a kill ratio of better than 20-1, Hutchins. You know what made that possible? Tommy shook his head, though he suspected he knew the answer. Piano wire? Hogan said softly. 37 cents worth of music wire and the knowledge to use it properly. You changed the tactical geometry of this entire sector. The Germans thought slopes over 35 degrees were impassable for armor. You proved them wrong, and we exploited that mistake to devastating effect. The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather folder. I'm putting you in for the Bronze Star for your actions during this engagement. Captain Webb is preparing the recommendation paperwork right now. You saved hundreds of American lives by enabling operations that shouldn't have been possible. Tommy didn't know what to say to that. The Bronze Star was a significant decoration, awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat. He'd just been trying to keep broken tanks running, trying to apply the principles his father had taught him about tension and load distribution. He hadn't been trying to win medals or change tactical doctrine. He'd just been trying to survive. "Sir," Tommy said finally, "I was just doing my job. Any mechanic with the right knowledge could have done the same thing." "But they didn't," Hogan replied. "You did. That's what makes the difference. Now get some rest, Hutchins. You've been working for 15 straight hours in sub-freezing temperatures. That's an order." Over the next 4 days, word of the piano wire modification spread through the 3rd Armored Division like wildfire. Maintenance companies began searching Belgian buildings for intact pianos, harvesting the wire with the careful technique Tommy had specified. By December 28th, approximately 170 Sherman tanks, across 5 armored battalions, had received the modification, and combat effectiveness reports showed a dramatic increase in mobility across difficult terrain. Slopes that had previously channeled American armor into predictable routes, where German anti-tank guns could set up killing zones, were now negotiable, allowing American tanks to approach from unexpected angles. The German response was telling. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that German tactical planners had identified the American suspension modifications in late December and had immediately begun analyzing the implications. One report, captured from a Panzer Battalion headquarters on December 30th, first, noted with alarm that American tanks are now climbing terrain we believed was impassable. Our defensive positions predicated on terrain channelization are no longer secure. We must establish new defensive lines accounting for American capability to cross slopes exceeding 40 degrees. Tommy spent those 4 days training other mechanics in the wire reinforcement technique, moving from unit to unit with his notebook and samples of properly modified springs. He discovered that the hardest part wasn't the physical act of wrapping wire. It was teaching people to hear the difference between correct tension and incorrect tension. You could measure it with instruments, but instruments took time and weren't always available in combat conditions. The fastest, most reliable method was to learn the sound of properly tensioned wire, that pure concert A tone that indicated 180 pounds of force distributed correctly across the spring coils. On January 2nd, 1945, a captain from Army Ordnance arrived at Task Force Hogan's position with orders to interview Tommy in detail about the modification procedure. The captain, a former MIT mechanical engineering professor named David Lawrence, spent 6 hours examining modified suspensions, reviewing Tommy's documentation, and conducting tensile strength tests on the piano wire. "This is remarkable," Lawrence said as he measured the load distribution on a modified bogie. "You've essentially created a composite spring system where the original coil spring and the wire reinforcement work in parallel. The combined spring rate is lower than either component alone, which increases travel and reduces peak stress. It's elegant. It's also something we should have figured out months ago in laboratory testing." "Sir," Tommy asked carefully, "does this mean the modification is going to become standard Army procedure?" Lawrence looked at him with the expression of a man who dealt with military bureaucracy long enough to be realistic about timelines. "Eventually, yes, but eventually in Army terms means months or years. We'll need to conduct formal testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, write technical specifications, update the tank repair manual, train maintenance personnel Army-wide. That process usually takes 12 to 18 months. In the meantime, I'm authorizing immediate field implementation across all armored units in the European theater. Your documentation is good enough for frontline mechanics to follow, and the combat effectiveness data is undeniable." The captain paused, then added, "Off the record, Private Hutchins, you just invented something that's probably going to get written into mechanical engineering textbooks after the war. Composite spring reinforcement using high tensile wire is applicable to everything from aircraft landing gear to heavy machinery. You've stumbled onto a fundamental principle that has applications far beyond tank suspensions." Tommy didn't know how to respond to that. He'd just been trying to keep broken equipment running, applying knowledge his father had taught him about piano tuning. The idea that it might have broader applications, that it might matter beyond just this one battle in this one frozen corner of Belgium, was overwhelming. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when American and British forces had pushed German troops back to their starting positions and eliminated the salient that had given the battle its name. Task Force Hogan had survived the engagement with 60% of its original strength, devastating losses by normal standards, but miraculous given the intensity of the fighting and the complete surprise of the German offensive. Tommy's piano wire modifications had spread throughout the 3rd Armored Division and beyond, with approximately 450 Sherman tanks receiving the reinforcement by the battle's end. The tactical impact was measurable in hard numbers. American tank losses, due to suspension failure, dropped from an average of 12% per week during the first 2 weeks of the battle to less than 3% per week after the modification became widespread. Tank mobility across difficult terrain increased by an estimated 40%, allowing American armor to outmaneuver German positions that had relied on terrain channelization for defensive advantage. Most importantly, the modification had enabled specific operations, like the assault on Hill 427, that would have been impossible with standard suspensions. On February 7, 1945, Tommy was summoned to 1st Army Headquarters in Spa, Belgium, where Major General Courtney Hodges personally presented him with the Bronze Star for meritorious achievement in a combat zone. The citation read, in part, "Private First Class Thomas J. Hutchins demonstrated exceptional technical skill and innovative thinking when he developed a field modification procedure that significantly increased the mobility and combat effectiveness of M4 Sherman tanks operating in difficult terrain during the Ardennes campaign. His suspension reinforcement technique enabled tactical operations previously considered impossible and directly contributed to the successful defense against German offensive operations in December 1944 and January 1945. Standing at attention while the general pinned the medal to his uniform, Tommy thought about his father back in Detroit, probably working on a piano at the Fisher Theater, adjusting tension on 2 and 20 strings to create perfect harmony. He thought about the 0.37 worth of piano wire that had become a tactical innovation affecting hundreds of tanks and thousands of men. He thought about the strange path that had led from watching his father tune pianos to lying in frozen mud underneath Sherman tanks, applying the same principles of tension and load distribution that made concert grands sing. After the ceremony, a first lieutenant from Army Ordnance pulled Tommy aside and showed him a preliminary technical manual page. Field Modification Procedure FM 9-2805B, Wire Reinforcement of Vertical Volute Spring Suspensions. The manual page included Tommy's diagrams, his tension specifications, and detailed instructions that any trained mechanic could follow. "This is going out to every armored unit in the European theater next week," the lieutenant said. "By March, it'll be standard procedure in the Pacific Theater too. Your modification is officially part of how the U.S. Army maintains its tanks." Tommy returned to the 3rd Armored Division in mid-February, as Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany. He was no longer just another maintenance crew member. He was now the division's suspension specialist, responsible for training mechanics and supervising modifications across multiple armored battalions. It was strange having authority based not on rank, but on knowledge, having captains and majors defer to his technical judgment, despite him being a 19-year-old private first class. The modification technique continued to evolve. A mechanic from the 4th Armored Division discovered that using 2 layers of thinner wire instead of single-layer thicker wire provided even better load distribution. A technical sergeant from the 6th Armored Division developed a quick-release version that could be installed in 20 minutes instead of 35 minutes. Tommy incorporated these innovations into the documentation, creating version 2.0 of the procedure that combined best practices from multiple units. It was the military innovation process working the way it was supposed to. Frontline personnel identifying problems, developing solutions, and sharing knowledge across unit boundaries. By April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final phase, approximately 2,100 Sherman tanks had received piano wire suspension reinforcements. The modification had become so standard that newly manufactured Sherman tanks coming off the assembly lines at the Detroit Tank Arsenal were being fitted with similar reinforcement systems as part of the original production process. Not piano wire, but specialized high-tensile steel cable that accomplished the same goal. Army Ordnance had taken Tommy's field expedient and engineered it into a permanent design improvement. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, Tommy was in Czechoslovakia with the 3rd Armored Division, supervising maintenance operations on Sherman tanks that had driven over 800 kilometers from the Rhine River to their final positions. Many of those tanks were still running on suspensions he'd personally modified 4 months earlier in frozen Belgian barns. The piano wire was showing wear. Some cables had frayed, some wraps had loosened, but they'd held long enough to see the war through to its end. Tommy returned to Detroit in September 1945, honorably discharged with the Bronze Star, a promotion to corporal that came through 3 days before his discharge, and a service record that noted his exceptional technical skills and innovative solutions to mechanical problems in combat conditions. He found his father still tuning pianos at the Fisher Theater, still adjusting tension on 2 strings to create perfect harmony. They sat together one evening in the small apartment where Tommy had grown up, drinking coffee and talking about the war, and Tommy tried to explain how the same principles that made pianos sing had also made Sherman tanks climb impossible slopes. Tension, his father said finally, nodding slowly. Everything's about finding the right tension. Too loose, and the structure collapses. Too tight, and it breaks under stress. The art is finding that balance point where all the forces support each other. That's exactly right, Tommy said. That's what I was trying to tell the Army engineers, but they kept wanting to complicate it with equations and stress analysis. It's simpler than that. You just need to feel the tension, hear when it's right. His father smiled, that particular expression of satisfaction that came from seeing a student understand a fundamental truth. You learned well, he said. Better than I expected. You took knowledge meant for making music and used it to save lives. That's a good trade. The U.S. Army officially adopted the wire reinforcement procedure as Technical Manual TM 9-2805B in December 1945, 5 months after the war ended. The manual acknowledged Tommy by name as the technique's originator and included his original diagrams and specifications. Army Ordnance estimated that the modification had increased tank mobility by 35–40% in difficult terrain and had prevented approximately 180 tank losses due to suspension failure during the final 6 months of the European War. Those 180 tanks represented approximately 900 lives saved, men who would have been killed or wounded in disabled vehicles, but who survived because piano wire kept their suspensions running. In 1947, a mechanical engineering professor at MIT named David Lawrence, the same captain who'd interviewed Tommy in Belgium, published a paper titled Composite Spring Reinforcement in Heavy Vehicle Suspensions, Analysis of Field Modifications during the Ardennes Campaign. The paper used Tommy's piano wire modification as a case study in practical engineering, arguing that some of the most important innovations came not from laboratory testing, but from frontline personnel solving immediate problems with available materials. The paper was widely cited and became required reading in several engineering programs. Tommy never became famous. He went back to working in automotive repair in Detroit, eventually opening his own shop that specialized in suspension work. He married a girl named Helen who worked at Ford's Willow Run plant, had 3 children, and lived a quiet middle-class life in suburban Michigan. But every time he worked on a vehicle's suspension, Every time he adjusted spring tension or diagnosed a handling problem, he thought about those frozen nights in Belgium, about Sherman tanks climbing impossible slopes, about the way simple physics could become a weapon more effective than any gun. The piano wire coil that he'd carried through the war, now reduced to maybe 50 feet of frayed cable, hung on his workshop wall alongside his bronze star. Customers would sometimes ask about it, and Tommy would tell them the story, always downplaying his own role, always emphasizing that he'd just been doing his job, that any mechanic with the right knowledge could have done the same thing. But the metal and the wire told a different story. They testified to a moment when a 19-year-old piano tuner's kid from Detroit had changed how the U.S. Army fought, when 37 cents worth of music wire had enabled tactical operations that saved hundreds of lives, when the knowledge passed from father to son about tension and harmony, and finding the right balance point had become the difference between victory and defeat. In the end, that was the lesson Tommy took from his war, that knowledge matters, that simple principles applied correctly can solve complex problems, and that sometimes the most important innovations come not from experts in laboratories, but from ordinary people who refuse to accept that something is impossible just because the manual says so. The piano wire had been just a tool. The real weapon had been the willingness to think differently, to see connections that others missed, to apply knowledge from one domain to solve problems in another. That was what had changed the Battle of the Bulge. That was what had made 43 Sherman tanks climb slopes the Germans thought were impassable. And that was what Tommy Hutchins carried with him for the rest of his life. Not pride in what he'd done, but understanding of what was possible when you combined knowledge, determination, and the refusal to quit even when everything seemed broken beyond repair.